I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. You've heard about the certainty of death and taxes. Turns out, both in the end, unknowable mysteries. For this episode, we bring you two other undying mysteries pretty close to death and taxes in their ability to befuddle: electricity rates and property tax assessments. Every January, the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation sends out new property valuations for a third of all the state's real properties, which is a term for actual physical property as opposed to intellectual property such as copyrights and patents. Maryland is one of only two states in the entire union that has a state agency devoted to property assessment. The other is Hawaii. In all other states, the taxing authority for real property, the local government, is also the assessing authority. We are special like that. This month, when the 2026 property assessments came in, it quickly became clear that homes in the same neighborhood, comparable based on publicly available information such as square footage and the number of bedrooms, saw widely different assessments. Many went up, which is to be expected these days. In my neighborhood, for example, I saw assessments go up $90,000. Most increases, however, were more modest. What struck me more was that many homes also saw their assessments go down. The maximum decline I found was $42,000. What was going on? Last week also saw another inscrutable move, this time in the world of electricity rates. PJM Interconnection, the largest regional electricity grid operator in the United States, which covers 13 states and Washington, D.C., including Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania, punted on a process that might have required power-guzzling data centers to build their own power plants or otherwise bring new generation in order for them to be connected to the electric grid. Several state leaders, including from Maryland and Virginia, and incredibly, President Trump himself, have demanded that large data centers do this to avoid steep increases in consumer electricity bills. We know that large data centers require a lot of power, and increase in demand leads to rising prices. This is already happening. States want data centers for their economic development and revenue potential, but also they want to avoid rising consumer electricity bills, which makes voters mad. The complicating factor is this: Virginia hosts half of all data centers in the world. That demand is not just raising electric bills in the Commonwealth, but already affecting the 12 other states in the PJM territory. So whether or not other states themselves allow data centers to populate, they are stuck with the problem. It is a dilemma that state leaders and voters across the PJM territory face. So increasing electricity rates and mixed property assessments, modern versions of death and taxes, are mysteries as well. To open the door to these mysteries, I am joined for this episode by Abe Silverman, an electricity regulation lawyer who does research at the Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University, and with Bob Yeager and Adam Lewis from the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation, called SDAT. Stay with us.
Walked this road about 1,000 times. You think by now I would have got it right. Broken pieces to pick up again. Cycle back to where we began. I don't mind. Baby, I don't mind. Suffocating, but I love the high. Coming
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's two new single releases, I Don't Mind and Tell Me What You Want. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com.
Suffocating, but I love the high. Coming on to you every time. Like a moth drawn to a flame.
Abe Silverman, welcome to I Hate Politics.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
PJM, the regional grid operator, after much deliberation, has decided not to propose rules that require large load data centers to bring their own generation. How do they explain that decision?
On Friday, two things happened. One is a bunch of PJM governors got together and released their plan. And then later in the afternoon, the PJM board issued their plan. The PJM board has now directed PJM staff to move forward in developing proposals around 6 different bullet items. One is, what's the role of long-term procurement in the market? We need to add a lot of new generation to the grid in order to serve the new data center load. And the fact is that the existing PJM market is not sending the appropriate investment price signals that are encouraging generators to invest the approximately $2 billion it takes to build a new power plant. So one of the things that both the governors and PJM agree on is that we should be implementing a long-term reliability procurement of new generation. But so the biggest thing that they said is we want to have a new long-term procurement, probably for 15 years, which is what the governors asked for. That is very, very significant. They have always historically used this 3-year forward capacity market, where we're buying the capacity that we need 3 years forward. And there's 1-year term commitment. So the generator is basically committing for 1 year to supply that capacity. And it's been very successful at keeping prices low. Now we're talking about locking in consumers for a 15-year contract at the cost of new entry, which is very expensive. So when we think about, what happened to your electric bills in Maryland, the biggest piece of the increase that you saw starting on June 1st, 2025, was the increase in the capacity market prices. We'd be talking about doubling those capacity market prices again, which is obviously, has real detrimental impacts on affordability. So having PJM come in and say we're now moving away from the system that we've relied on for the last, 15 years to keep, really 20 years to keep reliability in the PJM region is a major, major issue for them.
But the governors are asking for it in the belief that it'll actually stabilize prices.
The impact on consumers is a little bit complicated to figure out. But right now, we have this single clearing price market. So if prices increase to the new entry clearing price of, FERC set it at $550 per megawatt day last year, then we would really be in for some long-term sustained bill increases above what we're already seeing. So what PJM is saying is that they are going to come in and do a limited procurement of long-term capacity. And the question becomes, how do they then allocate the costs of that new capacity to consumers across the PJM grid?
What else does PJM say in terms of?
Yeah, so the second big place where really I think this is very important, that there is agreement with the governors, is on load forecasting. For years, has been kind of, has been, frankly, a relatively dull topic because we haven't had any load to forecast. But now with the data centers, the utilities are getting requests from data centers every day to connect to the grid sometime, in the next 5 years. And the data centers are coming in and saying, hey, we want 500 megawatts of power, some very, very large amount of electricity that they're asking for. And so under existing rules, the utilities take in those requests pursuant to their state law and their franchise, with the state, franchise agreement with the state. And currently, they aggregate those requests for new service and pass them along to PJM, who then goes out and buys capacity to meet both the existing load and the anticipated new load. One of the things that has become very apparent, both in PJM and really across the country, is that not every data center that seeks service will actually reach commercial operation. And not every data center that reaches commercial operation will use as much electricity as they're planning for. And so we kind of have this system where right now PJM is taking in these requests from the utilities, and nobody's really looking behind the curtain to say, is this data center real? Have they posted financial security that shows that they're, legit? Do they have site control? Do they have the chips that they need to construct?
What else has PJM proposed?
The other one that I think is really important is that they talk about how costs should be allocated. And so there's this real fundamental divide between the data centers and a lot of the advocates in particular, ratepayer advocates and consumer advocates, who are saying that the data center should pay their own way. And that retail customers, a mom and pop customer, should be insulated from the increased costs associated with the data center load.
Right.
So PJM comes in, and this part's a little bit of their proposal is a little bit unclear, but the governors are really clear that data centers should be allocated the cost of any of these new long-term procurements. And I think that's a very important detail that's going to have to get ironed out. We're going to have to see exactly what it is that PJM is proposing. And Sunil, I want to point out, your show is politics, right? I hate politics. President Trump last Monday was tweeting about this, saying that data center should not increase electricity costs for everyday Americans. And that's exactly what's happening right now. You had Microsoft coming out, one of the biggest data center operators in the world, talking about this as well and saying that, hey, we agree, we need to pay our own way. Google has now come out and said something similar. Equinix said something similar in November.
So the large data center people are going, okay, we'll pay for it, let us do it.
They're saying they're open to it. I think the devil's going to be in the details. And what does it mean to pay their fair share, right?
Okay.
And we're going to have to see whether they actually are willing to come in, say, and pay for a 15-year contract, including providing collateral support and long-term long-term financial assurances.
From a political point of view, when you see bills rising so fast, as has happened in Baltimore in the BG&E territory in the last year, 8 months, there is going to be political pressure on both sides now, clearly, of the political divide to bring that about. And one of the big mistakes we make is that we think politics should somehow be subservient. In fact, politics is never subservient to any other requirement. When confronted, economics loses to politics every single time.
But what's really striking, I think, Sunil, is the fact that you had Secretary Burgum, the president, as well as 13 governors from every governor in the PJM region coming together on a set of principles, truly is unprecedented. A lot of the states that are actually getting hit hardest by this recent bill increases are places like Ohio, which obviously are Republican strongholds. And Ohio has taken very strong action. Texas, noted liberal squish state, has actually taken very, very strong action on data centers that one might even dare call pro-consumer. Indiana as well. So a lot of the leadership that we've seen on controlling data center costs has actually come from red states. We're going to really see over the next few weeks, and I do think it is going to be over the next few weeks, whether the governors and PJM can reach consensus, on some of these major issues, and the places where they don't. And I'll highlight one where I think there isn't political consensus right now, is over the issue of the price cap. 1 year ago, Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania filed a complaint at FERC asking for a price cap in the PJM market. And ultimately, PJM capitulated and did indeed put in a price cap. If prices are not allowed to rise high enough, we will not see new investment in generation, right? Because nobody is going to build a $600 a megawatt day power plant and bid it into a market capped at $325. That's just not going to happen. But at the same time, it also doesn't make sense to send an infinitely high price signal if the market isn't actually able to respond, both because of delays in connecting, delays in building, and delays in supply chain. So if you send out a price signal that no one can respond to, yes, it will keep going up until until it induces new supply. But if there's no new supply to induce, then you're just sending money out into the void. So the governors came in very clearly and demanded an additional 2-year price cap. And the PJM board came out and said, we need to take more comments and we need to hear from more people about the price cap. So there is one major point of maybe not disagreement, but at least uncertainty.
There is also a difference. Now, clearly, as you also mentioned, the president and the governor together are differing from PJM with respect to requiring large load data centers to what is called bring their own generation.
6 months ago, in August 2025, PJM initiated this critical issue fast path. So that's the 6-month sprint where PJM looked at a whole bunch of different possible approaches for dealing with data centers, maintaining reliability, thinking about costs, and thinking about investment signals. And that process ultimately resulted in this board letter that came out on Friday. PJM's initial proposal was that data centers would be what they call curtailed or shut off if the grid got stressed. Data centers can avoid curtailment if they bring their own capacity. If a data center brings enough new generation to match the amount of electricity it's consuming, it is effectively has no impact on the market. And it has no impact on reliability. The price doesn't change. There was an immediate firestorm from the data centers, and PJM backtracked immediately. So now we have PJM coming back to the table, rebranding their non-capacity backed load NCBL initial proposal. They're now calling it a connect and manage strategy, which is, effectively saying that a data center can connect, and then PJM will manage their electricity consumption on a moment-by-moment basis. And if the grid is stressed, then PJM will tell the utility, okay, your utility zone is using too much electricity, you need to curtail. And that would effectively tell the data centers that they can get shut off during extreme grid events. And if they want to avoid that, they have to do some sort of either buy from this new 15-year capacity market, or they need to make alternative arrangements for bringing their own capacity. What we're saying here is you data center have to make some commercial decisions. You can agree to be flexible and get shut off when the grid is stressed. You can build new generation somewhere on the grid that's committed to serving your load. You can do the kind of behind the meter solutions that you're referring to. Or you can now buy from this new 15-year market. And I think the question, the PJM political question is, how do the data centers feel about these options? And, can they realistically continue to argue that they should be able to take advantage of the rules under the existing system, which are very favorable to them? Or are they going to have to sort of step up and take more financial responsibility?
In Virginia, the State Corporation Commission, which is their Public Services Utilities Commission, passed a rule that would allow differential pricing. When demand increases, everybody's rates go up. But in Virginia, they are managing that by saying there can be differential rates for different consumers, different type of customers, and you can create a category for large load folks and then have whatever rate that you want to do for them. Virginia used to be a Republican-led state. It is the place that has the maximum number of data centers, and it has a electricity system that is vertically integrated. That is, the utility generates most of the power that it needs. It has a hybrid system. It buys some also, but it manages the whole system. And so Maryland, in contrast, is a deregulated state where generation is separated and market based, and it is having trouble managing these questions, while in the vertical side, they seem to have a somewhat easier time. And Indiana is similar. Do you see any difference in whether a state is deregulated or vertically integrated in being able to have an effective response?
Yeah, but I also want to come back to this Virginia story you told. You told that as a very neat story where Virginia is being a good actor. There's two different costs we're trying to manage here. One is how individual rates at the state level are allocated between customer classes. But then the second question is, how is the activity of the state affecting the PJM wholesale rate?
Okay.
And when Virginia invests in data centers, they are effectively, they have in some ways, Virginia has crashed this market, and they're not alone. Ohio and Pennsylvania both come in for this as well. But their activities, their investment, their support of data centers, which has been a great boon to the state financially, right? They have a huge budget surplus and everything else, has effectively raised rates for everybody else in PJM.
Sure.
And so Maryland actually really did not cause this problem. And so Maryland is simply taking the interstate activity, the activities in other states, and is now seeing very, very high prices. And so I think it's important to recognize that what Virginia is doing really is, in a lot of ways, outsourcing their electric bills to states outside of Virginia.
But the question is, Virginia has more tools to control it. And Maryland, because of deregulation, do you think they have fewer tools?
Not really. It is different. Virginia is a complicated state because they're sort of half in, half out. They're somewhat unique. But let's take Indiana, which is a really great example, right? They're an old school, vertically integrated state. The utility, is the alpha and the omega of their electric planning. Mm-hmm. In many cases, the vertically integrated states, because I think they have a closer relationship with their customer, and they see the impacts of increasing customer bills. The anger is directed 100% at the utility. They have been faster and quicker to respond to the challenges associated with data centers. And they have, and I think Indiana is a great example of this. NIPSCO, Northern Indiana Power Service Company, put into place a new rule that requires any new data center to take service and enter into a contract for new generation to support that data center. That's something, Maryland could do that too.
So what do you think is stopping Maryland from doing that?
The PJM market, for the last 20 years has basically said, we will take care of resource adequacy. States, you don't need to worry about it. In fact, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court in 2014, which was Talon v. Hughes. Hughes was the Public Service Commissioner, chairman of Maryland, where Maryland tried to come in and incent new gas-fired generation and give them long-term contracts, and they were sued and told they couldn't do it. So for many years, PJM has said, hey, states, we will handle these resource adequacy issues for you. And now
But question is, why can Indiana do it? You see what I'm saying?
Maryland can do it too. I just think there's an added level of complexity of being in the PJM market.
But Indiana is in the PJM market.
Half of it is, half of it isn't. They're under a different regulatory regime. Legislators and executive branch members of the PJM states are recognizing that they cannot simply let PJM run and keep doing its thing. 13 governors coming to sign a letter about some pretty obscure PJM market design issues, and numerous pieces of legislation showing up in the Maryland legislature and other legislatures across the country show that people are waking up and recognizing that these cost issues are unsustainable, and they're thinking very hard about how to regulate data centers.
Will they succeed?
I think they will. I think they have to. And the first step is building the political consensus. And I think we're largely getting there. And seeing the biggest data center operators in the world come together and say, yeah, we kind of agree. President Trump saying he agrees. I mean, can you imagine another issue in which President Trump and Governor Moore are aligned?
Abe Silverman, thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
That was Abe Silverman of the Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Bob Yeager and Adam Lewis of the Maryland State Department of Assessment and Taxation to try to tease out why similar homes go up and down in assessment values in the same cycle. Bob Yeager, Adam Lewis, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
This month, January, you sent out a bunch of assessment letters. A third of all real property in Maryland is assessed every year. Where I live, near Rockville in Aspen Hill in Montgomery County, some of my neighbors have received an increase in assessment, some almost to $100,000, but others have gotten a reduction in their assessments up to $50,000. I tried to control for square footage and number of bedrooms and try to compare all of that. What is about the process that allows for this variance to occur?
Residential assessments rely heavily on market value and comparable sales. It's also reasonable to observe large swings, both up and down within a single neighborhood. The variation does not imply an error or any sort of inconsistency, and it doesn't require recent construction, renovation, or damage to occur. Controlling for things like location, lot size, square footage, bedrooms, it's helpful, but it doesn't capture the full scope of characteristics that we evaluate when we look at properties. So we look at things like construction quality, condition of the property.
How would you estimate condition?
Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about how we gradations of condition?
With the condition of the property, it's what is observed if the property transfers. We look at the effective age, not necessarily the actual age, which some people keep will replace roofs, which is normal maintenance, but it does alter the effective age of the house. And ultimately, if somebody starts to replace windows, other items within their house, that can affect the condition.
How do you know somebody has replaced their roof?
We pull the permit. Properties are grouped into valuation models that are based on similar characteristics, such as the style of the dwelling. So you'd have, for example, like 2-story properties with no basement, or you'd have a 1-story property that has a basement. So they're grouped into these valuation models, and those include elements like construction quality, as we talked about, the age and the effective age of the property, the size of the property. We can look at comparable sales to say what comparable sales fit in this grouping that we can make similar likely evaluations of what those properties would sell for. And then in that process, the assessors are refining through these different property types to look for variations that might put them into a different model.
You said construction quality. How would you track that?
So if it's a frame construction, if it's brick construction, if it's a stone construction,
but that won't change, right? I mean, a house is a brick or a frame since 1980 or not.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is, when we group these properties, it'll be all the similar construction quality properties are going to go into a similar category where they'll be valued, and the valuation of those properties will be based on that construction quality. Now, a stone house may have a higher value during one period in the market, but market may change. And for example, that may not be as desirable when the markets change. So,
how many categories of, say, construction quality or condition do you have? 300, or is it 25 or 7?
But the number of models will vary depending on the neighborhood. The number of models, you may see as many as 50 in a neighborhood. You may see sometimes as few as 4 or 5. It depends on the neighborhood.
It's much more granular than a neighborhood, because within that, you're going to have variations in sort of the lot shape, the topography of the land, sort of the frontage of the property, proximity to amenities, or roadways.
If you have a frame versus if you have brick, that's not going to change until there's a permit that comes in. If there's no permit, there is no change itself in the categorization.
The condition of a property is always changing. Properties are always in flux. Internal renovations may happen without a permit. A lot of times if you may not be required to have a permit.
But how would you know that?
When we look at our recent comparable sales, we're able to look at interior pictures from the MLS listings.
That is only for homes that have been sold. You're not seeing internally in homes that are not being sold, correct?
Right. I think the hardest thing for us to determine an interior of a property is someone who's owned it for a very long time. They haven't pulled any permits. They have not, hasn't changed hands, so they don't have any photographs. They don't have any interiors. So it's harder to factor in changes for those. And those will be modeled with other properties that do not have interior renovations on record.
I got a bunch of my neighbors to send me their evaluation letters because I was going to do this interview. So one of my neighbors I know replaced the roof. And other than that, it's pretty much the same for some time, but their evaluation went down significantly.
It's all based on some sales data of those models. The ones that did not sell, or didn't get a permit, or maybe they did do a minor improvement to their house. A roof in itself is not just going to be one aspect that just calls everybody has to replace a roof. I would say, what was the model of that home and compared to what sales that have occurred to that area? And sometimes we don't get any sales. So here's all these sales that have occurred on a certain model that maybe drove those up higher because of the demand for them. And then when maybe in this one style with limited sales or no sales at all, we may have to even go to a different neighborhood, or that may have indicated that certain style, here's a competing neighborhood, and it's not the same quote neighborhood that I lived in, but it's right down the street. And that may have, all those sales in there may have indicated a little bit of a decrease too, or whatever. $50,000, depending on the total value, may be a small percentage.
$50,000 it's maybe 8%. These homes are all like $600,000. Is 8% a lot or less? I don't even know that.
We do put controls in it. We review percentage changes. We have many edits that we do. That we are mandated to do too after a reassessment. However, what that assessment started at from 3 years ago, there may have been little indication then, and maybe the assessment, and I'm not saying we overassessed it, but maybe the market has softened, or we were, the previous assessment should have been maybe a little bit lower, and maybe this is kind of trying to correct itself as we got some more, sales activity.
Well, we're chasing sort of a moving target. Right. You know what I mean? And for things like roofs there's often not a permit pulled for a roof. They happen in one day. And that may be something that's not that's not apparent to an assessment. And what could happen with that is that may not be factored in this time, but then next time it may be something that there was no renovation that happened. And this gets to your point where how does that happen? And so suddenly we say, wait a minute, this property just has a new roof. And we look back and we see, do sort of research to find out about it. I would say, and we make the correction to the record. So we're all often updating the record on properties as we get new information.
When you send the assessment letters, because you may have it right, you may have it wrong, right? You may say new roof, but really isn't. That gives the homeowner some opportunity to say, this is an error.
What we make available for property owners is they can request their worksheet from the assessment office.
Tell people where and how to get that worksheet.
Our information for whatever local jurisdiction they live in is on our website. We list all of our local assessment offices. So that email, sending it in, saying, I'd like to have a worksheet and a sales listing for my office, we'll certainly get that out to you in the mail, or we'll even email it to you if we got your email. Now, under an appeal, you can get other worksheets, but to protect people, we send it to the mailing address we have on record, or if they've sent us an email and they provided us enough information that we feel comfortable that it's them, that we will return the email with their worksheet.
Okay. I want to ask about this multivariate analysis problem, which is that there are so many things going into it and it is so complex that it ends up becoming opaque. College admissions is exactly the same. Can you speak a little bit to too many variables problem? Should there be too many variables, or should we try as a philosophical matter to cut them down to make them more comprehensible and fair?
Well, our assessment process follows the International Association of Assessing Officers standards. The assessment process is designed to reflect the differences in properties, not smooth them out. So that's why it's such a very, very detailed analysis that goes into this process. Now, that said, even though it's a very, very technical, detailed process that we go into, we encourage property owners to, number one, they have the state allows them to have 45 days after they receive the assessment notice to appeal their property. But at any time, they can contact the assessment office and let us know information about your property that's not apparent, because we don't always know, certainly interior condition elements. And when you can talk to an assessor about what went into the valuation of your property and talk through, some of the preliminary discussion about the appeal process with them, and they can help you understand the assessment process. It's more fair, I think, to factor all those variables into it rather than to say, okay, we're going to make this simple for everybody. I think you're going to end up with a lot more unintended consequences if you do it that way.
Adam talked about having other people's worksheet on appeal. Explain that process.
Well, if upon filing an appeal, we send out a sales listing, and that's a requirement that we automatically provide you. Here's the list of the sales data that occurred in your neighborhood. And when I say neighborhood, it's market region. We try to identify things to try to group these models together. And at times, an owner, and now there is a small fee to it because of the, I guess, for the worksheet.
How much is the fee?
It's $1. Oh. And I think that just, and there's some cost involved, but it's a fee because I guess to keep somebody from saying, hey, I want 2,000 worksheets, I guess.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's a nominal fee. And, but what that allows for, then they can have these comparables. However, I would say at no charge, anybody can go to our website and there's a real property search for properties that you can enter in an address. Search by address, or you can search by count or map and block and lot, and you enter in that address, and it'll pull up basics about the home. It will tell you the size, the square, the finished basement. It'll tell you some of the details of maybe if a garage exists and number of bathrooms. But if you wanted more details as far as decks, the worksheet can provide that. As far as you can see the depreciation on that home, the model that it was called, if it was similar model as yours.
I want to point out to listeners that assessments are public and available to everybody that wants to see them on the SDAT website. There is another question I have, which is when sales are low, how does that impact your assessment? Particularly because the assessments are so heavily dependent on comparable sales.
So
I mean,
only
I think one thing you mentioned was that you expand the area.
That happens in a lot of our rural areas of the state of Maryland. I mean, if you're in Western Maryland or in the rural Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, you may not have the neighborhoods aren't as homogeneous. They are not as similar. But as you know, an assessor acts as an appraiser as well. So you have to ultimately locate, say I don't have any split foyer sales, but I got some rancher sales. And you probably would apply some of those comparables to help support what you're doing. And you would make.
How would you do that? I mean, would you just take the square footage?
In our system, as we're doing an assessment, we have an analysis tool that pulls together things by model number. And as an assessor, that's where it comes into a little bit more of their background and experience to then say, I have these. We're developing a cost record of the property. So when you see your worksheet, you're going to see it built on cost first. Okay. And then we apply these indexes. So the index, you're going to see an index for the region, your county multiplier, because it's going to that same rancher in Washington County is going to cost different to build than in Montgomery County. Sure. And so then we have that index, and then we have a market index. And the market index is based on these sales that we have reviewed. I've worked 31 years with the department. We've never not had any sales in a jurisdiction. So there's always been something that's sold. So you can take that sale, and then your experienced assessor would try to take that and then say, okay, if this sold at this index, maybe it's a nicer quality house, so I'm going to use a smaller index on the lower quality house, but I still got to apply an index to it. And maybe that index still on this one showed that there was an increase or a decrease, and I might carry that differently than into that next model to say, okay, this as a whole property went down 5%, so I don't have any sales of this property, I'm going to go down 5%. Or I got support that everything went up 10%, but this particular model went down 5%. This model is going to go down 5%. Meanwhile, I got I got market support. It all comes down to market. You talked about earlier mentioning, hey, there's so many, it's so opaque and so many variables. But I think when an owner, whether they're looking at their assessment or we're looking at it, it ultimately comes down to what can we support. As far as that owner feels comfortable that they hears the sales and I feel like they're over, my assessment's incorrect. Or here's as an assessor, we're listening to the appeal, but we also understand we have to be uniform. Like, I don't want to give you an unfair, affirm yours, and then your neighbor comes in, you got the same house and I'm reducing it. So I'm looking at my market support to say, okay, is it warrant a decrease or not?
Do you all calculate the annualized basis of successful appeals? What percentage of properties assessed in a particular year are adjusted later on?
We do have those statistics. However, we don't. Some people have assumed this. There is no, we do not dictate to say you can only reduce 20% of them. The assessors are free to make their recommendation for what is right, and the supervisors then approve those recommendations, so that it has another set of eyes, whether the property is being affirmed or reduced. A supervisor has to reduce it.
The one thing I would point out is that we're always on guard against over-assessing a property. So we're always trying to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. But when there's a question, we want to stay, for example, we try to stay between 96 and 98% of the market value. We never want a situation where we've valued someone over the amount that they could likely sell that property for.
Bob Yeager, Adam Lewis, thank you for taking the time to explain a really complex part of modern life.
Thank you, Sunil. Really appreciate the opportunity.
That's Bob Yeager, Director of the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation, and Adam Lewis, the Supervisor for the Real Property Division within the department.
Lean at the past behind, leaning to the moment, dancing what you
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's 2 new single releases, I Don't Mind and Tell Me What You Want. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.